Today on Ungraded, we are joined by Aswin Punathambekar, a media scholar whose work explores global media, popular culture, digital platforms, and media industries. His research also focuses on how media travels across various borders, how platforms shape culture and everyday life, and also about how technologies like film, television, and streaming operates within the global system. He also teaches media and communication, encouraging the students to think critically about platforms, technology, culture, and power in a rapidly changing media environment. Hello, Professor Punathambekar. It is so good to meet you and have you here at School of Digital Media and Communication. We are in the Moving Images, and I am Shriya Raj, a Master's in Mass Communication and Journalism student.
It's nice to meet you, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. So, to start off with, I would like to ask about your experience and journey you've gone through the media and communication. So, your academic journey has taken you across different countries, like institutions and also media cultures. So, when you look back now, what were some early experiences that shaped your interest in studying media and communication today?
I think there are a couple of things now looking back I can think about. I think it started as early as my childhood. So I grew up watching films from a very young age. And I think a lot of my friends and family still make fun of me for this. I used to be part of a Rajnikant fan club in Chennai growing up, and that sparked a long-standing interest in films and film cultures, but also industries. But then as an engineer, I started life as an engineer and then moved into media and communication studies. And even through my engineering days, I was actively involved in the literary society, editing the magazine, and so on. And I just wanted to keep continuing in thinking about science and technology, but from more humanistic, social, scientific perspectives, and that led me into media and communication.
That sounds really great, sir. So you lived through some major shifts, like in media, from VHS tapes and also to satellite to streaming platforms right now. So how did these experiences change your way of asking questions, like as a media scholar?
I would say even pre-VHS. So I was very much part of that generation for whom VCRs entered the picture and really transformed film culture, fan practices, the way industries work, and so on. I think the single most important thing is to grasp is that there's no inevitable sort of following up of one thing after another. So when we're looking at media systems today, the key is to understand how each new development is layered on top of another. So there's never any clean break from one media technology to another. It's not a rupture or a disruption, but there are all kinds of continuities in terms of production practices, genres, style, aesthetic elements, and so on. And there are continuities also in terms of our collective memories. For instance, if do you have a TikTok?
Yeah.
Or an Insta reel, right? Sometimes you might choose to go back to an 80s film song for your reel, and that immediately tells you that there's a deep historical intermedia relationship that is part of our lives, and that's part of even our digital media world. So instead of thinking about these as breaks, we need to continually think about continuities for sometimes over a century, while at the same time figuring out what's genuinely new and what that newness then does to our collective practices.
So we often get to hear in media that it has a very drastic shift from media-driven to now a creator economy. So from your work, sir, how do you understand this particular shift? And also, what does platformization really change for creators, influencers, and also audiences like us?
That's a great question. We could spend an entire semester-long seminar on this, but we'll try to keep it like about 2 minutes or so. I think the first thing I would point to is once again the importance of taking a slightly more historical view. Right? So when we think about something like, say, film societies and fan clubs, they were also participatory. So audiences were involved. There were these vibrant film society movements in India and other parts of the world, but it was very much about writing, creating certain kinds of artifacts, circulating them. Now, they were never part of a formal kind of media system. And that seems to have become very much part of our media world, say, sometime beginning in the mid-2000s, where fandom, creation, participatory culture got neatly co-opted into industry logics. And then once the smartphone sort of begins to take off, once telecommunication infrastructure gets established in India, where data rates are inexpensive and really affordable for millions of people to own things. And as a consequence, virtually anybody right now with a smartphone can be somebody who's circulating things, right? So the top-down kind of circulation model has been taken apart. So platformization has a very obvious effect in that sense, that we are each one of us potentially a media distributor and potentially a media maker, which is in one sense really important. And there is a strand there of being able to think about this as a genuinely open democratic kind of system. But I think it'll be a mistake for us to just cast this wide framework and say, oh, it's all wonderful and it's all democratic, because platforms come with their own logics, right? Platform companies, the algorithms they run on, they shape what gets seen and what gets heard. Governments have a very heavy hand to play in what gets circulated on platforms. Takedown orders are common. If Netflix, let's say, produces a show that is, for whatever reason, deemed sensitive, they are forced to take it down. So I think it's like, once again, we have to strike a balance as citizens and as media consumers of adopting this critical view where we say, yes, platforms are great. They've given us the power to do things as everyday consumers and citizens, but we also have to be aware of these sort of hidden forces of how platforms moderate content, how algorithms shape what gets circulated, and how, in the end of the day, it's a market-driven system. And despite everything that any government might tell us, they still have very large role to play in this ecosystem. So we have to balance all of these different perspectives if you have to truly understand what the creative economy is. And at this point, the creative economy is also part of the legacy industries, right? So let's say you, in 10 years, you become a media mogul and you run your own television company. That will be a very hybrid company, right? It won't just be a purely sort of televisual thing. It'll be televisual, it'll be digital, it'll be participatory. And so that's, I think, the challenge for all of us, is to be able to move across these media forms and understand where the convergences are, but also where new things are coming up and they're departing from the old.
Sir, also I would really be happy if you talk about the book From Bombay to Bollywood. So in that you've mentioned that you encouraged us basically to look beyond cinema and also talk about media industries being a part of larger global systems and all. So what led you to actually think in this way?
It really started with a master's thesis. And this was a very small study. And I was in Boston at the time. I was doing my master's in comparative media studies at MIT. And it was a study to understand the ongoing sort of influence that cinema and film music in particular, and how that was shaping lives in the diasporic community among South Asian Americans living in the world. Right? So I spent about 6 months with 10 families and really trying to understand their migration history, their backgrounds, and how media and especially popular culture like film fit in. And towards the end of it, and this was late 90s, early 2000s, this was when, if you remember, a lot of popular Hindi films were beginning to actively situate themselves in terms of the story itself in various parts of the world, especially in the UK and the US, DDLJ, K3G, those kinds of films, right? And what that really led me to realize very quickly was this wasn't just about audiences wanting certain kinds of things that were fitting into their lives as migrants, but that the industry in Mumbai was actively thinking about other markets globally. Now, the Hindi film industry has always been global in a sense. There have been circulations into Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. Movies have always been a part of Middle East lives and so on. But this was a slightly different model. This was a more deliberate corporate industrial strategy where these companies were beginning to actively think about overseas markets as distribution territories. And that was in turn changing their production practices. So I then decided for my PhD to then really delve deep into that. So I ended up spending a lot of time in Mumbai. I would attend these industry conventions that this organization called FICCI would organize yearly, where the film industry would come together. And what was immediately apparent was it wasn't just the film industry people would show up. All the satellite television companies were showing up, and at the time, all the .com companies were showing up. So this was just around the time when the .com economy was taking off, when Times of India had launched a new portal called indiatimes.com that had a major section on films, for instance. So it became very apparent quickly that this was a convergent media landscape. If you wanted to understand the workings of a media industry in a city like Mumbai, you couldn't look at it purely as a film industry that had neat boundaries around it. You had to look at relationships across media industries: film, sound, television, digital. And that really began to help me understand how media industries were beginning to take shape in an era of digital change. And then likewise, once you start following the money, you realize, oh, you can't stay within national borders. So suddenly you had companies from various parts of the world investing. So once you start following the financing, the insurance, the migration of talent and so on, it became a way for me to understand how what used to be thought of as a national cinema had become something that they were calling global. And it's not that, again, not that they weren't global before, but this particular way of being global was new. And that's what I wanted to try. And even now, I think it become very clear that the way in which, let's say, a production company like Karan Johar's company, the way they rebranded and positioned themselves for these new forms of money that were coming in, that really laid the foundation for them to enter Netflix, for instance. So had they remained a very old school family-run company, they wouldn't have been able to negotiate with streaming platforms like Netflix. So that 10 to 15-year transition that happened, starting in 98, 99, all the way to about 2010, that really was foundational to the way some of these very established players are now some of the most powerful players in the streaming economy.
That's really great, sir. So, as we know, media is actually changing really quickly. But like with AI, data systems, and platform economy shaping us, so many students, they actually feel excited, but also really overwhelmed by this space. So, from your experience, what kind of mindset would you suggest to like the students should have right now?
Again, you're doing the right thing in even asking that question, right? So I would say that you've already taken that really first crucial step, which is to just pull back from the hype and to pull back from the everyday kind of really rapid, frenetic. Every day we wake up to some news about a new LLM model, a new Gen AI model, a new way of producing a video, and so on and so forth. And platforms are very quick to embrace this, right? Everything from your music that you can embed to the kinds of animations, the kinds of video backgrounds you can quickly embed. So it keeps changing very fast, right? But then when you stop for a moment and think, the core of it still remains somewhat easy to decipher, which is storytelling, which is really thinking carefully about narrative choices, really thinking carefully about how to introduce certain kinds of genre elements, be it dramatic, be it comedic, be it or whatever those might be, but also a certain responsibility as communicators to really step back and think, how is what I'm doing as an influencer or just as a student producing reels for friends and family is to stop and think about what are the kinds of things that I'm communicating through this thing. Ideas about authenticity. Am I being true to who I am? Is this my true self? If I'm going to circulate a piece of news, can I stop for a moment and think, is this the right kind of news to circulate? Or should I maybe do a little bit of checking and see if this is really valuable or if this is something that's bordering on misinformation? Right? So I think we can all, each of us, cultivate some critical practices. And from a student perspective, really the only way to do that is to worry less about what's the next new thing, because by the time you graduate, there'll be another 5 new things, right? So you can't keep worrying about playing catch up, but instead to say, are there a set of reading and writing skills? And by writing, I mean very broadly. Writing for a podcast like you have done, these wonderful questions that you frame. This is a really important step, right? You've taken so much care to think about what I've done and ask me these questions that already reflects that you've thought about it in terms of how to write for this podcast, right? So these things are going to endure. In 10 years from now, the interview as a format has stayed the same for about 100 years now. But the way we're conducting it, the way it circulates might change. But the basic medium for our communication right now is talk. And talk is something that radio invented, and we're still continuing with it. And the core of it is really reflection, thinking carefully, and writing in a way that makes it clear, both for yourself, the one who's asking the questions. You made me comfortable as the guest in figuring out these questions, And then hopefully this conversation is making sense to the listeners of this podcast, right? And so those are the things that endure. So I would say as students, worry less about playing catch up with every new technological development and really spend your 3-4 years here at university absorbing as much as you can from as many disciplines as you can. Read historical stuff, read anthropology, read the sociological literature, keep up with your engineering classmates. And just absorbing all of that at this point in your life will make sure that 10 years from now, you still have the skills that you need. No matter how much the technological world has changed or the media world has changed, you will still be able to navigate those changes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your experiences and everything with us. The conversation we've made is really good and we've got through a lot from this. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for inviting me.
This is Shriya wrapping up another episode of Ungraded. Thank you.